Alright, what's going on, everybody, man? Welcome back. You know what it is. This is my Patreon series, baby. Long tutorials. And today we're going to be talking about the second part of shading, which is really going to be shading transitions. So last time I showed you how to do this stuff, you know, the basics of shading. I talked about the principles, all of that stuff. And today we're gonna talk about, you know, the next step, which is really just shading transitions and really thinking about edges. So I'm gonna be talking about some principles. I'm gonna show you some master's work that has really inspired me. I'm gonna show you the before and after of all of this stuff. I'm gonna talk about the process, and then I'm also gonna do them in real time so you can really see how I do this shit. And it's gonna be a pretty long tutorial, but you know, I really hope this shit helps you. So let's start out with talking about why this master's work looks so beautiful. So I've kind of like gathered some different portraits that have really inspired me through the years. Unfortunately, I'm not really sure who created them. I just know that this one is by Nathan Folks. And I actually had the luck of finding the references for these portraits because I've been looking at these portraits. I just couldn't find this one though. But I've been looking at these two portraits probably for the last 3-4 years. And I'm not even exaggerating when I say that I've spent fucking countless hours looking at this shit. Like when I paint, like you might have seen me, I always have somebody else's work on the side just for not only inspiration but to also kind of like study their shading and really like look at what they're doing. So I was just so amazed when I found that references because I was like, yo, fucking masters, like it just looking at the reference and kind of like how it transitioned into a painting was one of the most amazing shit ever. And by the way, I feel like I'm nowhere near this master's level. Like I feel like I'm still studying them, but I just wanted to kind of share with you what I've learned from, you know, so much studying from these two portraits and this one as well. And what it is that if you look at the reference, there's not as much information as there is in the painting. Like if you look at this painting, you can actually see that there's actually much more juice is what I like to call it. Like all these different strokes and all these different edges, like you see none of that in the reference. Like if anything in the reference, it looks super fucking flat right here. And then this artist added all these different jewels. And what I kind of like realized after seeing this reference is that this artist understands some shit that's way deeper than just looking at the reference. And another thing that I think that people don't realize is that when they see somebody sort of copying a reference, they think that that's a study. You know, they think like, oh, this artist is just copying the reference just to kind of like, you know, paint this one person. But if you look at this portrait, you don't even need to see the reference. Like this is just so beautiful. You can look at it. Like if you go to a museum, right? Like you're never like, oh, I wonder who is this woman in the painting. Nah, you just look at the painting and you fucking admire it because it's just so beautiful. So the first thing that you have to realize is that what these masters is doing, I mean, I don't know what the fuck they're doing because I'm not them. But from a side view, I think that they're not just doing a copy of the reference and that they're adding a lot more extra and they're trying to make it much more beautiful than the reference. And, you know, I spent, like, if you look at my old work, let me pull this shit up. If you look at my old work from 2015, 2016, 2017, 18, and 19, I spent every single year doing a painting every single day. So each one of these folders has over 300 paintings. And I've spent a lot of time just copying all these photos and all these different pictures, just trying to kind of like get to their level. And sure, I've gotten so much better, but what I kind of realized is that, you know, all this information that's actually in the paintings, I think can be kind of like studied with just studying the exercises. So I kind of like developed all this stuff that I'm talking about now with shading the planes and, you know, breaking down the Sarohead, all this stuff. Like I really just, like I didn't really read it in a book. I mean, I've heard about the Sarohead before, but I really just invented all this shit just by coaching people and getting them better. So I'm not like, don't get me wrong, I'm not sure if this is like the best way to learn. I just know that I spend so much time just copying pictures, and I've gotten definitely better. But I think that if you break it down into steps by step basis and you really like learn this shit one thing at a time, you can really just kind of like get there faster. And the biggest thing about this master's work is that it looks so beautiful because there's just a lot of choices. What I mean by that is that this artist is not just copying the reference again, he's making choices on what's gonna look good. Like, it almost feels like this artist is just kind of like fucking with you, because he didn't, like, if you look at this fucking eye, what the fuck is this shit right here? Like, he just has a random fucking brushstroke right across the eye, and that shit still looks so fucking beautiful. And it's not like, it's not only in this place. Like, you can kind of see, like, I swear I've spent so much time looking at this shit. He's just kind of completely added his own version of the reference. So it's like, if you look at this one as well, it's kind of like, bro, this motherfucker was like, you know what, I'm not even gonna paint an eye, I'm just gonna make you think that's an eye, and you're still gonna love this shit. So it's kind of like, this guy is just so good. Like, look at those brush strokes. He's just so good that he's almost like making it seem so effortless that your eye is just kind of like, oh my god, what the fuck is this shit? How do you even do this shit? You know? And by the way, I couldn't even comprehend like what was happening in these portraits. Like, when I first saw them a couple of years ago, I was like, okay, this looks kind of cool. But it wasn't until like, you know, probably a year ago or 2 years ago where I was like, yo, this shit, like, I've never seen anything like this. Like, this is some, fuck Mona Lisa, fuck all these stupid shit that was painted centuries ago. This is the shit right here that makes my cock hard, you know? So it's really the just the finest shit that I've ever seen. So it's kind of like, the way that I like to picture it, that it's just so advanced that if you just stare it constantly, it's almost gonna depress you. So if you look at, like, the way that I like to imagine it, you know, I have all these goofy metaphors. If you try to be a fighter, right, and you look at another fighter who's been fighting for the last 20 years and he's doing backflips and just crazy fucking shit, you're just gonna lose your mind, because you're gonna be like, bro, I can't even raise my leg. How the fuck are you supposed to do this shit? So that's when people start saying it's talent, or, you know, it's all these different stuff. So that's why I really believe in this idea of just kind of like keeping it simple and going about it step by step. And what I was going to talk about, the choices that I mentioned, is that this artist understands the human face so well. He understands edges so well. He understands value so well. Like, he doesn't even need color to make this shit so awesome. So what he really does is he picks and chooses which things to add, because he knows which things are going to look pleasing to the eye. And unfortunately, I don't even know how to teach this pleasing to the eye type of shit. But fortunately, what I can teach you is how to get closer to this level. So the way to really understand all these choices and stuff is to really understand what is there in the face. Because when you look at the reference, again, like, there's nothing here. Like, there's no, like, you can kind of see how it's just so faded out, and this person knows where to put a hard edge. So if you just copy this one, you know, what people call a master study, that's going to be kind of useful, because you're going to understand, you know, this, like, you might understand this cheekbone, or, you know, the highlight, or whatever, but it's not really going to teach you for all the other references. Like, it's not, in the long run, it's not as useful. It's definitely better than doing imagination painting, but I feel like it's still not something that you can apply through, you know, every single angle. So that's why I've kind of like developed this different methods in like shading planes, and then moving to transitions, and then rendering, so you can really like start learning this stuff by yourself, and then just studying every single angle, like studying every single plane. And when you know all of these planes and you know how to manipulate them, then you can actually make some choices, and then you can really make your portrait super soft. Because really the thing that makes this so beautiful is just the effortlessness. Like it just looks like it was painted with like 3 brush strokes. It looks soft, but yet it looks hard. Like it just has the perfect balance. And again, you can't do that unless you have all the information. Like it'll be stupid of you to even think that, you know, just you can splatter some brush strokes right now and make it look like this. If you go back to the metaphor with a fighter, that would be like you jumping into the air and thinking that you can do a backflip or, you know, kick somebody in the face. Like it's just like, bro, you need to first learn how to jump, you know? So this is why I've kind of like developed this stuff. And again, like with years of me teaching later on, I might change it. Like I might tell you like, this is how you do it, this is not how you do it, because I'm constantly getting better at understanding this stuff myself. You know, I'm nowhere near perfect in understanding this shit. But for now, like I'm really confident if you just follow this step that I talked about last time, and now you really understand how to shade those transitions, you're just gonna get better at understanding the human face. And if you keep practicing, you're gonna really understand what's pleasing to the eye, because that's really some philosophy shit. Like I don't even know if you can really explain what's pleasing to the eye. But anyway, this is why I really talk about just breaking down everything into little planes and really understanding them, understanding how to shade, because a lot of people also say like, oh, I'm so bored with males, I want to do some females or some goofy shit like this. And if you actually look at a lot of the females, I mean pretty much all females, they're even softer than the males. So it's kind of like, bro, there's no information in here for you to study. Imagine if this was a female. Like this is a male and they're still super flat, there's still no information there. And you see all these choices, like how do you think you're gonna understand all these different choices, all these different edges, and really how to make it pleasing if there's nothing in the fucking reference? So that's why I keep preaching, you know, this shit about really painting males and really understanding it structural. So anyway, this is why I really believe in this shit, and this is why I feel like Master's work is so beautiful, because they really understand all this stuff. By the way, I'm not saying that they did this shit. I don't even know what they did. I'm guessing they locked themselves in a fucking apartment for 30 years, or maybe not even an apartment, maybe a cave or something. They painted for 30 fucking years or something. I don't know what they did, but I feel like the way that I've gotten there is really like I understood all this stuff about the planes that I had. So this is why Master's Works looks beautiful. So now let's talk about the step process. You know, last time I showed you how to get to here. And by the way, really make sure that you watch the last video at least a couple of times. Make sure you send me your work for critique, and I really like told you what you need to change, and then I actually told you like you can move on to the next stage. Because again, if your planes don't look right and your shading at this level doesn't look right, if you get to this stage, it's gonna look even worse. So the only way to really understand all these steps and all these exercises and stuff is to really like get them one at a time and really just fucking push through them and really perfect them, and then get to the next one. So really the step process is, you know, last time I showed you the light and shadow breakdown. So we pretty much just separated the shadows from the lights. We did the local colors, all that stuff. So now you take that sketch, and the first thing you do is you actually fade out the lines of the planes. So we already did fade out the lines last time. You know, it was like a lot more line weight was onto the features than the planes. But now we completely remove the planes. Like you can still kind of see a little ghost line just to not forget that it's, you know, it's there. But still in that final, it's barely visible. Like it's much less visible than the initial one. So you fade out the lines, and then you just start refining planes. And again, you know, if you don't understand these planes well and you didn't really practice the first step, when you fade them out, you're really gonna ruin your initial kind of like first step of shading. And by the way, when you first start doing the second step of shading, you're gonna ruin all of your really nice lay-ins. So it's kind of like part of the process, but you really need to be confident of your planes before you even start doing all this stuff. So once you fade out the lines, I really just start refining the planes and transitions. So you can kind of see how these portraits are actually pretty similar, but all I do is I just add more definition into those planes. So it's not even detail. Like if you look at that eye, look at this eye, and now look at this eye, and even look at the eye on the final. Like it's, I mean, that's not the final, but it's the final of this exercise. There's not more detail there. Like it's the same amount of detail. What there is just more plane definition. Like it's about you just going from a bigger plane to a smaller plane. So from here you can kind of see how in the forehead I just pretty much everything is just one value, and then in the shadows, you know, you have the triangle and stuff, but it's not really refined. If you look at the finish from this exercise, you can kind of see how there's still not like any little details or any brush strokes or anything, but you can clearly see where all the planes are, and they just look more pleasing because I really refined them and I put the right edges. Like I just didn't, like in the first step, like this one right here, as I told you last time, it's more about painting by numbers. You know, it's kind of like this is 1, this is 2, and you just fill it out with a certain type of a value. Now in this stage, you start more really leaning on to the edges. Like you start really thinking about, well, okay, how does this plane connect to this plane? And we did that last time with either a soft edge or a hard edge, but this time we're really gonna think about, well, okay, this, how dark or how soft does this need to be? And then we have halftones. So before we develop, you know, the highlights, you need to really like have the reflected light, and then you also need to have the halftones. So before, you know, in this stage, in the first stage, we pretty much just had one shadow layer and like one darker shadow layer. So now we really like erase or add that local color to the reflected light, and then we also add halftones into the light. So going back to the different levels that I talked about, actually, did I do 5 as like the lightest or the darkest? I get confused with these fucking numbers. Let's say that 1 is actually the darkest. I think I did it the opposite way, but it makes more sense this way. So if 1 is the darkest, which is pretty much going to be the iris and the hair, the next one is pretty much going to be the core and drop shadows. So that's going to be this cheekbone, this right here, you know, pretty much like the darkest areas of shadows, you know. And then you have 3, which is pretty much going to be a general shadow, which is going to be like this right here, this right here. And then you have 4, which is going to be a regular halftone into the lights. So the way that you can kind of think about it is that 3 can be a halftone into the shadows, and 4 can be a halftone or a transition into the lights. Or actually, we still don't have any lights, but into the local color. And then 5 is pretty much going to be the local color and the reflected light. And again, you need to really develop all these different stuff before you add the highlights, because when you add the highlights, those 5 different values, they're gonna turn into like 7 or 8 or even 10. And it's fucking confusing to understand it now. Imagine what's gonna happen if you have all these 10 ones. That's exactly why I say that beginners really get confused and they just start shading all these different shit. And they're like, whoa, fucking gradients and soft brushes, because they don't really just take really structural one thing at a time. So that's the way to do it. Really think about it as just 5 different levels and really define a number to every single plane and be like, you know what, this needs to be a 1, this needs to be a 2. I mean, do it in your mind. You don't need to fucking write this shit. So that's pretty much the next thing, is just developing every plane and puzzle solving. So if you look at this, it always just reminds me of a puzzle. So you just have all these different pieces that connect to each other, and they have a different local value next to it, and then you also think how they relate to each other. So remember, we're not trying to have like a finished product or like even like that many soft edges. You might see me like add a soft edge for somewhere. For example, like this plane is obviously gonna be a soft one because you don't see, like in the reference, you don't, you know, if you see a hard edge in here or a soft right next to it, that's gonna be obvious. But when there's like almost no information, for example, this reference right here, you just can't make everything soft because then it's gonna look horrible. So it's really just deciding, well, does this need to be a hard edge or does this need to be a soft edge? And then when you add the local value, it's kind of like you're just solving a puzzle all the time. It's like you're finding the next piece. Imagine like you're starting from like the biggest piece, and then you're finding like smaller and smaller pieces. And then for the next stage, when you have all these pieces, the next tutorial that I'm gonna talk about, which is pretty much rendering, when you have all the pieces, it's much easier to really render them out and make it kind of like more beautiful. We're still never, I mean, not never, but hopefully hopefully one day you're gonna get to this level, but I'm not sure if I can teach you this shit. But I can definitely teach you how to get to like a level where it actually looks like a portrait. So that's really what we're doing, is we're just taking it from a really big piece and then just defining it smaller and smaller until we can actually get to the rendering. And then you have lights and highlights, which I pretty much just talked about. But the way that I like to think about the lights and the highlights is pretty much just the same way like the shadows. Like you have a lighter, you have a normal light, and then you just have highlights, which are gonna be, for example, right here with the red, or the nose, or right here on the edge. Those are really gonna be the highlights. The others are just general lights. But you're gonna see later that when I actually do this in real time. And then you have glazing, lasso tool, and using the X. So I pretty much talked about glazing last time, but just to remind you again, I'm not even sure what that fucking word means, by the way. I just really like it, so I just decided to call it fucking glazing. But what I call glazing is when you get a bigger brush and you have, for example, you get 10% dark. So that's a really dark color. That's pretty much 10%. But if you just want to make something a little bit darker, for example, let's say that this cheekbone needs to be darker. If you get, like this cheekbone is 20%, right? If you just get 20 or 19% and you just go on top, you're gonna ruin all those edges. You're gonna ruin everything because you're just pressing so hard. So what glazing is getting like an extreme value and it's just pressing really lightly. So it's kind of like, it's pretty much what people do with soft brushes, but instead of me doing it with a soft brush, I do it with a harder, with the brick one. And then if I need to like fade it out, I do this with a smudge tool. So if you look at this layer, this is what glazing is. This is before and this is after. Like it's really subtle, but if you kind of like do it on top of plane after plane after plane, you really just start separating them more and more. So that's what glazing is. It's not about you, like, for example, if you want to make this one darker, like you don't just pick an opaque value and then just start going like this, because you're gonna ruin all of the different and subtle texture and all of the edges that you already built, or hopefully you built from the previous step. Instead, I get like a much darker, color or value, and I just softly go like this, and then I think about the edge again and I refine the edge. So every time you do a brush stroke, you really need to think, well, is this gonna be soft on one side? Does it need to be hard? Like what value? Like again, it's all about just problem solving and really thinking about it strategically. Like you can't afford to make random brush strokes. Like that's how you end up with amateurish fucking look. When you get good and you get a master level, you can add all these little fucking pieces and scratches into the eyes. You can do whatever the fuck you want to. But when you're still learning, you really gotta be mindful of this shit. And then we have the lasso. I've pretty much just talked about it before, but the lasso is what I use for all the really hard edges. For example, if you have this one right here, instead of me going with, let's say I want to make this darker, right? If I just go in, with a new layer and I just glaze like this, glazing can make like a lot of soft edges. And then if you try to make it with an eraser, you're not really sure exactly where the edge is. So I might use the lasso to really like refine to find exactly where the edge is, and then I go with some glazing. So it's pretty much, I use a combination of this thing. I use glazing, lasso tool, smudge tool, and the next thing is really the X. And what I mean by X is the keyboard shortcut. If you press X, actually, like look at what happens right here. So it pretty much just flips the two colors, right? So you're gonna constantly see me in real time when I paint. I pick one color and then I pick a darker color. So that makes it really fast for me to kind of and I'm sorry for all the people that are using Procreate or something that they don't have any fucking shortcuts. I feel for you, but I don't know how to do it. I mean, you can still do it without shortcuts. It's just gonna take a longer time. But for anybody using Photoshop, it's really useful to use the X, because I'm either like, when I'm glazing, I just either go for like a darker or a lighter color, and I just already have them. So I'm constantly just flipping to the colors. And then also one thing that I didn't talk about is a lot of the highlights are actually done, and the light areas are done with a lasso tool, because in the lights you're gonna notice that there's a lot more hard edges, because when it comes to lights, you know, and master's work as well, you're gonna notice that a lot of the juice, a lot of the real refined form comes from the highlights. So when you're doing the highlights, or you know, all these things that you add in the final, you really need to be confident with it. So the lasso tool is the best way to do that. So if I'm doing, let's say for example, this portrait, I'm doing the cheekbone right here, you can kind of still do it without the lasso. Like you can just do a brush stroke and then erase it, but I feel like that's gonna might be slower, and it's not gonna give you a crisp edge. So instead I just get the lasso. Again, my lasso is actually on Z, so it's really easy just to press Z. I think it's on L if you're not using my brush strokes, and then I just do like a really confident brush stroke, and look at how that creates like a really juicy highlight. So that's pretty much it for glazing, lasso, and using X. So that's all the principles, that's all the steps, the master work. Really, I hope this shit makes sense, man. It makes so much fucking sense in my head, but you know, if you still don't understand something, make sure you ask me some questions so I can get better, and hopefully future tutorials are also going to be better. So now let's go over all the work that we did last time, and let's get to the next step. Alright, now let's start out first with the front view. Now when it comes to layers, I have one layer for all the shading, I have one layer for the lines, and I have one layer for the background. That's all you need. Just keep it simple, and then when we add more and more information, I'm gonna be using more layers. But there's no need for you to have 10,000 layers, and there's also no need to have everything on only one layer, because remember, we're trying to leave some of those lines. So the first thing that I do is I pick the shadow layer, and I get the brick brush for eraser. You know, I make it on 80% opacity. You can just do that with pressing 8, and I just fade out all of the planes. You know, that might be kind of scary when you first do it, because you're gonna see that all of your beautiful edge shading turns out that it's not that beautiful, because when there's no line weight to actually hold it together, it kind of looks really messy and stuff. But that's, you know, that's pretty much, damn, I should have talked about this earlier, but what really this stage is about is you just replacing lines with paint. So, you know, if you actually have only lines and you rely purely on the line weight, there's not enough information there. It doesn't look like a painting. So all we're trying to do is slowly replace the lines with the paint. But remember, slowly, and really like doing it with planes, because if you just completely get from sketching to final shading, again, it's gonna be super confusing. So after you fade out the lines, I start a new layer, and I start really like making some choices. And by the way, as I'm painting, I might not be talking as much, you know, because I still can explain all of the choices and stuff, but you're gonna watch me do every single one of those. That's why I really wanted to talk about all the different things before we even started. So the first thing I really do is I start out with a reflective light. So a reflected fucking shit. So I pick up the local color, I use a combination of the lasso tool and stuff, and I start looking at where that reflected light is gonna be. So this plane in the back, this right here under the eye, this right here where the forehead is gonna be, and then this plane right here. So it's kind of like we go back to the shadows and we introduce that number 5 level, which is gonna be the local color, and we just replace all of that information. So look at that layer before and after. See how it refines those planes in the back, and it just like, I didn't even add any details or nothing. It's just purely me just refining more of those planes. Then right here for the nose, you know, the bottom of the nose is also gonna catch some of that reflected light, and then maybe right here for a little bit under the eyebrow. So that's it, you know, for the reflected light. Really simple. You can kind of see how I did it in literally 2 minutes. and then I merge it and I start another layer. So now I'm thinking about those halftones on the side of the local color. So I pick a darker shadow layer, but I make it a little bit brighter because remember, halftones are not gonna be as dark as the shadow, and I just press really lightly and I just kind of glaze over. So in the step before, it was a lot more confident brush strokes and really like when you're doing the shadows, it's kind of like shadows, you know. But now when you're doing the halftones, you need to be kind of like a lot more gentle, because remember, halftones are gonna be kind of like a transition. It's not like their own sort of, you know, like when you're doing shadows, you're really like doing a whole separate plane. It's kind of like a core shadow is a whole different transition of a plane. This right here is more of a, actually a core shadow is a transition of an area, and this is a transition of a plane. I think I talked about this last time. So I refined pretty much this cheekbone right here, the wings of the nose, and right here where the mouth is gonna transition to the plane right here. So it's kind of like purely transitions very lightly. Let me show you before and after. So it's just kind of like going from big to small. So that's it for, you know, really simple. That's it for the shadows of the light. Now we start refining the shadows and kind of like their transition to the halftones. So you can kind of see how over here there's still not enough information. So what I do is I get a darker color, darker value right here for the nose, and I start filling out, you know, everything that's gonna be below the nose. I pick like a lasso tool to mark out like an area, and I just glaze over to make those shadows kind of darker and to make it look like there's a transition. So if you look at the nose, you can kind of see how right here with the red is darker, and as it gets down it kind of gets lighter, then it gets dark again. So that's all I do, is I just look at the reference, I see what's happening in the reference, and I just exaggerate what I'm seeing and combine it with my skill and with my knowledge from the planes. So it's kind of like I look at this area, like this one right here. Actually, let's zoom in. So I look at this area right here with the cheekbone. I look at, okay, where is it darker? Where is it lighter? How does it transition? What kind of an edge? What kind of a value? And how is the transition happening? And then I look at my drawing and I'm like, okay, well, what's the difference? Well, mine doesn't have as many values. Mine doesn't have as a soft edge, and mine is not transitioning as well. So what I do is I pick a darker color to kind of make it darker on the edge. Then I transition it right here. I pick a lighter. Now it's okay for you to start using the color picker. You know, when we're only doing the shadows, you know, it was much more strict. It was just kind of like you introducing two different values. But now when you try to transition like a soft edge, instead of you just going to the layer below and using the smudge, what I do is just pick a color, pick a value from the light side, and I kind of push it to the darker, and then I push the dark and I kind of push it to the light. And if you want to make a really big soft edge, so this is kind of like, let me show you the triangle before and after. So this was before and this is after. Again, really subtle. Like you can kind of see how with all these steps and stuff, it's really subtle, but then the final, like from this to this, doesn't look as subtle. Like there's definitely a difference. So don't think that you need to add all these different little details or spend 11 hours doing this. I mean, at first it might be like, you know, 2 hours because you're not used to doing all these different transitions. But remember, it's about you just thinking more rather than just painting and adding all these different brush strokes. Try to show more with less. That's what you're trying to do. So I'm looking at the reference, kind of like the eyebrows need to be darker. This part right here under the eye needs to be kind of darker like this. Oh shit, I didn't even save a step before, so I can show you all the process, but it's cool. Then right here, this needs to be darker. Then see how there's like, there needs to be an edge right here, so you can show that there's a turning from this plane to this plane. So every time you need to show that there's like a plane turning into a plane, you can kind of make your brush smaller and almost make it look like there's a plane in there. And that really helps with the 3D effect. Remember, we're trying to exaggerate what we're actually seeing, because if you completely copy what you're seeing, you're going to end up with a shitty version of the reference. What we're trying to do is end up with a structural version of the reference. If you want to make like a bigger soft edge, like right here, instead of you blending, because that's going to take a lot of brush strokes and it's going to end up looking super messy, I just go to the layer below, I get a smudge, and actually just smudge it out like this, and you end up with a soft edge. Then we go back to the layer on top. You know, I start looking at the lips, and the way that I do it right now is just so I can show you more and more examples. I'm kind of like jumping from area to area to just explain different things so you can understand it. But when you're doing it on your own, you can just stick to one area. Like you don't have to like jump the eyebrow now or the cheekbone now. Like for example, you just start out with the cheekbones or the eyebrows, and you're like, okay, what needs to get tighter? Like what is wrong with this area? But you also need to constantly compare everything else to like this one area to all the other areas. Like don't just stick to the eyebrow for fucking 50 minutes and then everything else just ends up looking super unfinished, and then the eyebrow is perfectly finished. Like just constantly compare, okay, what is lacking? Like even though you're focusing on one area, always think about the portrait as a whole. Like nobody's gonna care if your eyebrows look perfect or if this area looks perfect if the overall looks shitty. Like sometimes, funny enough, adding like all of the detail on only one place might end up looking, the overall might make it look bad. So if somebody looks at it, I think that's a lot of the mindset for beginners, is when they look at a portrait, you know, they start justifying it. Well, it looks beautiful because of this or because of that, or there's a lot of detail here. And it's like, bro, when you look at it, does it look good? Like with the masters, you look at this shit, there's fucking lines everywhere. But still, when you look at it, it's fucking juicy. So it's not about detail. It's not about, you know, one area. It's about the overall process. So I kind of go to the irises. I make those darker. I'm thinking about this plane right here needs to be a little bit darker, so there's more separation from this plane to this plane. And again, look at how rough that looks. It doesn't look like the reference, but it still looks a lot more structural. Like this, what this exercise is all about. It's not about you just making it perfect. It's not about you just making it soft. It's about you just kind of learning how to transition these planes and kind of like how to make them tighter. So I go back to the neck, make it darker. And another thing, I talked about it last time, but just to repeat myself for a million fucking time, I'm constantly making my brush smaller and bigger. So again, for people that are using Procreate, oh, somebody calling me, bitch, I'm doing Patreon right now. So for people using Procreate, I'm not really sure I mean, you can have it on the side with a slider, but if you're using Photoshop, you know, you have the shortcuts. I have them on A and F, so I'm constantly making my brush smaller and bigger, and that's a great habit to get into, because it really allows you to kind of like paint from bigger planes to smaller planes and constantly introduce these different type of things. So look at before and after. See that? It's just purely just adding more information. It's not about, I don't know, am I even making sense? Like when I fucking record for a long time, I feel like I'm just repeating the same 7 words, but I swear in my head it makes perfect fucking sense. So I just kind of look, for example, the ears, like they need to have more darkness into those planes, and they need to be kind of tighter. There needs to be a glazing. Like I'm constantly comparing edges, I'm comparing values, I'm comparing transitions, and I'm just thinking, how can I make this look even more structural? Harder edges, making the hards harder, making the soft softer. Actually, not even making the soft softer. That's for the next one. Forget what I just said. So that's pretty much for the second stage. That's what I meant when I said, you know, shading the transition. So this is before and this is after. This is how you make it tighter. So see, it just looked like I was adding like some random fucking brush strokes, but when you look at it overall, it just starts looking more and more like a portrait. It happens really slowly. It's not like I just add like some detail and it just looks like a portrait all of a sudden. So once you have this, I start adding the highlight. So new layer, I picked the local color, which is pretty much at like 40 right now. So I'll pick like a 60, and I start with really big brush strokes. So think back on how you did the planes before. Sorry, not the planes, but how you did the shadows before. So it's pretty similar to this. It's not about like really small brush strokes, because that's gonna make it look really like undefined. Like you need to develop all of the lines. Like imagine like right here, if you look at it, it's really flat. So you need to make all of the buildup of the light and then add the highlight. And right here you have a hard edge like this. Then you have the nose going like this. See how I'm still thinking about planes? I'm still thinking about, you know, do I go down? Do I go side to side? Like right here, you know, you have this triangle right here. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with you still looking at the arrowhead. Like if that helps you, you can pull out the arrowhead right next to you and kind of be like, what plane was that? Like, how do I do this? But again, really thinking about this shit. Then right here on the side, see how there's like two planes like this and this. And if you look at the reference, they look kind of similar, but you can kind of see how over here it's darker and it kind of gets lighter as it progresses to the edge, because that means that the light is coming from here. So what I do is I make a lasso tool on the edge, and I make this plane kind of lighter like this, and I make it glaze over the other one. So this is something that I use all the time for the highlights, which is I pick an area and I make one plane lighter, because what it is that all of these planes right here need to get lighter, but it kind of needs to happen with the levels. Again, it's not like if you just make it light like this, look at how ugly that looks, like fucking bleach or something. So instead, I know that the main light, like the main light is supposed to be right here on this plane, and I just glaze over the other ones. So I use the brick constantly just to kind of glaze and make everything lighter, but I know that which plane exactly needs to be lighter than the other ones. So lasso tool, this edge, then like this. It's a lot of constantly just glazing and you know, picking the lasso tool. And right here for the wings, actually the wings, you know, I've talked this about this before, but the nose, almost always I make the wings darker. So I make the wing darker, and right here I pick a lasso tool, and see how I pick this, and then I make it just soft on the edge with the smudge tool. Then right here you have the edge of the lip, a lasso tool, boom, and then a bigger brush stroke. Remember, this is a circle, so it kind of goes around. Let's see what we did. So before and after. Like when you have this right here, right, like this looks like some ugly ass overlap. Oftentimes I'll just use the smudge to kind of like get rid of the overlap, or just use an eraser to just kind of fade it out, and see how that just kind of like removes it. Then you have this plane below the eye. You know, you have this plane needs to be more refined. Again, I just kind of like glaze, and I look at the reference and I'm like, okay, is this light enough? Is there enough of a transition here? And if you're doubting, is it enough? It's always better to make it look more defined in the reference. So this kind of like starts looking a little bit like somebody who has a lot of face scars, but it's better to keep it more separated than it is to keep it less separated. So let me show you what it's not supposed to look like. So it's not supposed to look like this, because then you lose all of the different structure that we already built. Look at how ugly that looks. So instead, you know, it's just slowly glazing and just slowly building up those lights. There's gonna be a little bit of light right here onto the shadow part, you know, onto the edge like this. And right here, the eyebrow. And pretty much the smallest my brush stroke gets, smaller my brush gets, is kind of like this. Like you're never gonna see me zoom in or like right here and be like, oh, this needs to be a little bit brighter. Like that's gonna be the next part. So really bigger planes and bigger brush strokes. And right here for the neck, kind of going like this. And then don't forget the ears. Go one brush stroke like this, one like this. And again, don't compare yourself. Oh, by the way, we we forgot the reflected light. By the way, if you notice that you forgot like reflected light or, you know, core shadows or something, you can still do it on the same layer as you did the lights. Like, it's okay, but just make sure that you pick the color of the reflected light. That don't just glaze over with the light, because let me show you, if you actually are, you know, painting with like 60%, if you glaze on top of the ear and you're thinking that this is reflected light, even though it might look correct, now this here is 50%. And if you look at the face is 40 and 30. So this here, even though it might look correct to you, to somebody who just looks at it or like a professional or something, this here looks way off because that's way too bright. So never glaze on top of reflected light with the actual main light. If you want to paint the reflected light, just pick a reflected light value, or pick, if you just want to softly glaze, what I told you before is like you need to pick a more extreme value. Just pick something that's a little bit above that, and then just, but ultimately, you know, just take it one step at a time. And when you're doing reflected light, just do reflected light. But for little corrections, it's kind of okay. So yeah, I think that's it for the face. You know, you can add like little highlights in the eyes. I mean, you can get away with that, or the nose. I'm gonna let you do that, but no fucking other details. So little highlight like this, I just add like a little dot here, a little dot right here, and then a little brush stroke just to add the light into the eye. So that's all the eye I do, right? Like, let me show you. So little dot and then one brush stroke to show the light. And then if it looks too much like Scarface, you just use the smudge to kind of like soften some of those edges. But you know, it's pretty much just gonna be choices, and just looking at the reference and deciding which needs to be brighter or which needs to be harder, or all of that shit. So that's it for the face. Look at before and after, and then we just have the hair, and then we're done. Now the hair, again, I'm gonna be doing a whole separate, you know, hair tutorial, but pretty much what I do is I just think about those planes that are already built in the last step, and I really, oh, by the way, we didn't even add the shadows, we didn't even refine the hair. Oh, that's shit, that's my fault, I'm sorry. So before we add the highlights, let's actually refine the planes of the hair, because I was looking at the hair like, man, it's not really as defined as I wanted it to be, and then I realized, well, that's because you didn't even fucking define it. So first thing I do is I just use the planes that are already built from the last step, and pretty much like the face, I just use smaller brush strokes, and it just kind of like look at how can I make it even more refined. So brush strokes for the core shadows, brush strokes for the drop shadows, like this. Smaller ones, and really just separating it even more than before. Like, it really needs to kind of look like different, like if you picture plastic worms or sugar worms, what was that shit called? Like, you know, there's this candy that looks like worms. That's kind of like what the hair fucking looks like. So I just think about those transitions, and boom. So see, before and after, it's just kind of like making it tighter. And then we have the highlights, which I get a lighter color, and now I'm thinking about those middle planes. So see that middle plane right here? I just make a brush stroke like this. I get an eraser and I erase one side and I erase another side, and it kind of ends up looking like a highlight. So it's pretty much like one brush stroke, eraser one side, eraser on the other side, and that way you get sort of a soft edge, you get soft on the other, but you also get like a highlight right here on the edge. I think I've talked about this before. You pretty much have the letter H. So when you're erasing, you don't just erase with the same size of an eraser, because you're gonna end up erasing everything. What I do is I make a brush stroke and I make my eraser a little bit smaller. So when I erase, as I'm erasing, I'm actually making it smaller and smaller. So you kind of end up, this is the shape that you kind of want. This is not what you want. This is too basic. But when you're first starting out, I mean, again, I feel like this is a little bit too advanced. But you can definitely fuck around with all these brush strokes and stuff. But for the hair, it's gonna be really specific. You know, this is something that I don't really use anywhere else. So I just think about those highlights, and I just think about exactly where the highlight is gonna be. Pretty much look at the reference, middle right here. Sometimes I use the lasso tool. Sometimes I just use a smaller brush stroke. Sometimes I use a bigger one. What you just pretty much have to stay away from is just making it all the same. Like you just add the same highlight like this, it's just gonna look boring and kind of like a technique. Like it's funny, I feel with art, everything is supposed to be a technique, but it's kind of like you're not supposed to get caught that it's a technique. You know what I mean? Because if somebody looks at your painting and it's kind of like, oh, you painted this like this or something, it's just gonna look, you know, kind of boring or something. I feel like when you look at Master's work, it just looks so fucking random and shit. Like it looks like, you know, he didn't even try. It's almost like he was fucking with you. He's like, bro, I don't even care. I'm just gonna put this shit right here. But I can assure you, this motherfucker definitely knew what the fuck he was doing. So, and again, this is pretty much some advanced shit, but, you know, for the hair, you need to have a technique and know what you're doing, but it really needs to not look like a technique. I know. Art is a mind fuck. Don't even. Been struggling with this shit for 5 years, man. This shit tough as hell. So those are the highlights for the hair. Let me show you before and after. Boom. And this is pretty much what you have for this angle. I guess you can kind of refine the coat a little bit. Make it darker in some places, think about transitions and stuff, but that's gonna be pretty much the same techniques. What I really want to show you in these videos is kind of like my techniques. Like it's not about the different details or something. It's pretty much something that, because I feel like a lot of tutorials like show you like, okay, I'm gonna make the most beautiful painting, and it's kind of like, bro, okay, I mean, this is beautiful, but I really want to learn. Like I want to teach you some stuff that you can use in any different painting, or kind of like just to use it without looking at the video. It's not about me just doing like some beautiful random painting. I mean, I just want to make sure that it's beautiful enough so you can be like, yo, I don't even want to learn from this guy. What the fuck is this shit? But yeah, it's not about it being beautiful. So this is it for the front angle, and now let's get to the side. Alright, next up we got the side view. You know, one layer for the lines, one for the shading, one for the background. Start out picking a big eraser, 80% opacity. Hold on, I pressed the wrong fucking number. And then you just clean up all of those lines that you have. And don't press multiple times, because if you have it on 80% and you press multiple times, it completely removes it. Like what I do is I just kind of glaze over. I press hard, but I just make sure it's only one time, because if you press 2 times, now it's like double time the 80. You know what I'm saying? Like now it's 2 brush strokes. So when I glaze over it, I make sure that I don't actually, I should have talked about this shit. I swear, man, I miss all of the important fucking things. But I don't actually move my pen up. Like I just make sure that I just keep it pressed. So fade out all of the different planes. Of course, don't fade out, you know, the jaw or any of the features. Like just make sure that all of the planes from the cheekbone, around the mouth, like those are the planes that you want to remove. And then I just start out with, you also, I think the way that you see it on YouTube, it's gonna be a little bit more contrast, which is good because you can see more details. But in my monitor, it actually looks like it's not contrasty enough. So you can kind of go to levels and make the darks more dark, or make the lights a little bit more light. So that's something that, you know, if the last step kind of like left you with something that was too faded, you can definitely use levels. But just make sure that, you know, you're not using levels to just replace more information and more planes. You're just doing it so there's more contrast there. It's not for you to replace everything that you're doing. So I start out with the eye right here, like this whole area, and immediately if you look at the eye, right, what I did before is I just have a shadow right here. I just have shadow and light. Now I start breaking it down further. So for example, when you look at these planes, if you look at the reference, kind of like 1, 2, 3, and it's like a 4th one. It actually needs to be kind of like this. So if you look at these planes right here, right, you can kind of see how this one is going to be darker, and then it gets progressively lighter, and then this is lighter as well. And then when you look at, so that's the first thing I look at all the bigger planes and kind of like how dark they are compared to each other. And then I look at each individual plane and I look at the transition inside of that plane. So for example, this plane right here is going to be the darkest, but where is going to be darkest? So it's going to be darkest right here. That's going to be close to the eye. So knowing that, you know, and by the way, if you don't understand this stuff, which is not true if you're still a beginner, you can kind of do it on top of the reference and really break down the reference like before with this stuff. Why can't you see it? Oh, okay. So when you break it down, just kind of like try to look at it and ask yourself, well, where is that transition? Why is it being darker there? And really just analyze it before you even start painting, because that's going to be much easier. Like, don't just like it's pretty much like if you're still not like, I mean, in the beginning you're not going to be sure of anything, but if you're totally not sure, it means you need to go back to the previous step. So I start out with this plane right here, and I start out with just darkening the eyebrow a little bit, darkening the iris, darkening this plane, darkening this one, and just leaving this into a halftone. Now you can kind of see how there's no transition in this plane, so I just pick this value and I just add like a transition kind of going in like this with a soft edge, and I get to this one, I pick a darker value, I start making this darker, and then you can kind of see how there's a hard edge right here, and then there's a hard edge right here, and then it kind of gets soft as you get on the bottom. So because, you know, I feel like I've painted a lot of portraits, it's really easy for me to kind of like look at all this stuff and just problem solve. But again, it's all choices, so you gotta make some tough choices. And later when I tell you, when you send it on the critique, that's why I always tell you gotta make choices so I can really tell you what you did wrong. If you don't make choices, if you make everything soft, I can't really tell you what you did wrong. I can just tell you made everything fucking soft. So this is kind of like the plane for the eyes. So see, that was before and that's after. So it's pretty much like I refined, for example, like this plane right here, I refined eyelash and I added more separation into this plane and this plane. And I just kind of get lower into the nose area. I start refining this. I start making the lips darker, kind of glazing over. I add a harder edge right here on the lips. And I feel like a lot of tutorials also, like, even though they talk about exactly what they're doing, it's kind of like, but why are you doing this? You know, why are you making this darker? Like I used to be that type of guy. Like, why? Well, okay, you're doing this, but why? You know, and just constantly be the why guy. And I mean, that's good because it shows that you want to learn, but it's also kind of like, it's pretty much a lot of practice. And as I said, a lot of solving problems. So as you solve more and more, you're really gonna, this is why I always say that I really believe in the being self-taught, because as you just kind of like teach yourself to paint this stuff and a lot of references, the answers are gonna come. You just need to focus on just doing it over and over again. So see, this is the definition that I add into that side. And with this reference, you know, it's a lot of actually of the planes are going to be in light, so you're not even going to see that much into the shadow. So I think that's pretty much for just kind of refining the shadows, just making some things darker, adding more definition into the lips, adding more like of a plane right here for the nose, maybe adding like a transition right here for the front of the nose. And now I merge everything, I mean for the shadow layer, and then I get to the highlights. Now for the highlights, you know, especially with this reference, I know it might be like super confusing for beginners, but pretty much what you have to do is you have to think about where the light is coming from and which planes are gonna catch the most light. So if you look at the reference, you can kind of see how the light is coming from here. So naturally, the planes that are going to be facing this part of the light are going to catch the most. So this plane right here in the back, this one on the top right here, and maybe this one. So if you know that, you know, there's a plane right here, there's a plane right here, and there's one right here, and in the middle there's the cheekbone, if you just make everything the same amount of light, it's just gonna look flat. So naturally you have to choose which are gonna be lighter and which are gonna be darker. So naturally all of them are gonna be lighter than the halftones. You need to kind of glaze all of them, but you need to separate them and make some of them lighter than the other ones. So the way that I solve this problem is if you look at the ones that I already did before, and by the way, you know, it might look like I'm doing this really fast, but don't forget I did this before the video just to kind of prepare myself. So a lot of those choices are already in my head, so I can kind of be prepared for this. So don't compare yourself to what you see in the video. So in here, because you know you have light on this side, on this side, on this side, I just kind of like forcefully make the cheekbone a little bit darker, so that way you can kind of separate the planes and show them even more and show that separation. Wait, where did it go? Before and after. Oh, right here. So see how in the reference there's not really any separation here, like it's pretty much the same. But again, if you make it the same, there's no structure. So that's what all I did is I just refined this a lot more. And you know, for the masters, it's all about the creative license and then just deciding which things are gonna actually look better. So that's what I do. Let me go back to the light layer. So I start out, you know, with kind of like thinking about where the lightest plane is gonna be. I kind of like do this and I just glaze over. You know, I use the eraser to kind of clean it up, and then I use a glaze for all the other ones. You know, you have this right here, and then you have sort of a harder edge. Then you have this right here for the mouth, kind of going in like this, using the eraser to clean it up. You have the chin a little bit, and you can kind of already see how it starts looking more and more 3D, you know, just because I pay attention to those planes and I kind of like separate them with the light. And then you have this plane, then you have this one, then you have some light right here for the nose, you have some light right here for the, and the way that, you know what it kind of reminds me of? It reminds me of this, what is it called? Like when you play games and you look at the fields, like it just kind of looks like you're looking at some fields from the sky, from like a top view, and you're just looking at all these little grass fields. That's what it reminds me of. But something that I didn't talk about is how it's always important for one plane, like if there's no information in the reference, it's always important to add that information according to the planes. I mean, I guess I talked about it, but you know, if you look at this as like 5, and then this is kind of like 4.5, and this is or actually, you know what, this is 4 and then this is 3, so this is almost like part of the shadow, like this triangle right here. So in the reference you don't see it as much, but again I just push it so I can kind of like get some of that structure out. And then you kind of have this, and then there's a softer transition. And in the next stage, you know, the rendering, I'm gonna show you how when you have those different separations and stuff, when you actually merge everything and we start using the mixer brush and more of the smudge, and we actually start making things softer, it's gonna actually start looking more and more like the portrait. So don't worry if it's not looking like the portrait, you know, that's gonna come later. For now, really just focus on the transitions. That's why this stage is it's all about separation and just kind of like defining it more and more. Okay, I really feel like I'm repeating myself a million fucking times. And then you have the ear, kind of like this plane, inside of the ear. And then you have top of the lip, a little bit of a highlight for the lip. Inside the eye, you know, you can add like a little highlight, and then remember just a little brush stroke, kind of like this. So that's pretty much it for the face. You know, you see refining planes and a lot of glazing. And we get to the hair. I didn't refine the hair, but let's do that now. You know, darker brush stroke, and then just start thinking about the transitions even more before we even add all of the highlights. So I think about, pretty much I talked about it last time with this type of hair. It's all about core shadows and drop shadows. I mean, that's pretty much for all hair. And then you have right here for the back, you have a transition like this. And then we have the highlights. So lasso tool, remember the technique I showed you, smaller brush, doing the H, and I just repeat it, but I make sure that it's a different brush stroke, it's a different angle. And sometimes I might just do like a longer short brush stroke, small brush stroke. Sometimes I might do like a bigger one, but it's pretty much the same technique. It's just over and over again, but just making it super different, so that way it can kind of look actually like hair, not just like a broomstick. Sometimes I might add like just like a sharp triangle or something. Like I just might like do a lasso tool and then just add this sort of shape. But mostly I'll just stick to the H for the middle, you know, for the middle highlights. If you have like a corner of a hair, that's when I really add that triangle and I kind of make a smaller brush stroke. So let me show you before and after. Boom. Separating planes, baby. This is what we're doing. This is what I need to put that on a shirt. Separate planes and glazing and all these fucking, I feel like I'm speaking a foreign language. And then we have the back and just smaller ones right here. Boom. So that's it for the hair. And then for the polo, you know, maybe just a little bit of refining right here for the edge, and just a little bit more of a transition towards the light. And there you have it. Let me show you the before and after, but I didn't save it, so I need to go back to the original file. So this, and now this, boom. So see how it looks exactly like the same painting, it just looks tighter. Like it looks like there's more defined planes. Alright, now we have the 3/4 view, just 2 more to go. Let me just merge all of the layers. And we start out by fading the lines. 80%, you know the deal. Just kind of like removing all of that line weight that we worked so hard for. No, we actually worked more for the feature, so it's okay. It's okay. You can remove that shit. So start out, new layer. You can kind of make, using the levels, you can kind of make it a little bit more contrasty. Just a little bit, you know, before and after. It's just so subtle. And we start out by adding the reflected light, you know. Oh, I said it right, baby. We having progress. So pick the local color and start out by thinking where the reflected light is gonna be. You know, this triangle in the back, which is gonna hit. You remember the light is coming in from, actually it's coming in somewhere from the top right there, but you can kind of see how the bottom is gonna catch the majority of it, like this thing with the purple. But this thing with the cyan is also gonna have a little bit of reflected light. This right here, back in the neck, and a little bit on the lip. I don't know why the nose doesn't have more. Like, I think the nose is supposed to have a little bit more, but for some reason it doesn't. But it's okay. So I start out just by adding that reflected light right here in the back of the triangle, right here below. Maybe a little bit on the nose, even though it's not in the reference. And then right here on the neck. And maybe erase a little bit of triangle because it was too aggressive. And then just kind of merge that. Then we start with transitioning the shadows. Or I can actually add the halftones first. So this plane right here, you can kind of see how the eyebrow, like if you study the sorrow, you know that there's a little bit of a little plane right here, right on top of the eyebrow. So let me show you actually. So the eyebrow, the tempo is like this, right? And there's like one side, one plane right here, which is gonna be like this. There's one plane like this, and then there's 3 planes for the forehead, or like this. But then right here, there's a little bit of a, let me get another color. This right here with the green is gonna be another, like a tempo, and right here, you're gonna have this plane, which is gonna be really important to kind of like show that the eyebrow is not completely, because if there's no plane like this, you just make the forehead super squarish. You can actually even see it in the video, like see how this highlight goes right to the corner of the eyebrow. So that corner of the eyebrow actually has this triangular sort of plane right into it. So just kind of like refining the half tones into the local color into the shadows, and then just looking at what can I glaze, what can I make a hard edge. This is more of a, I think this is more of a beginner's reference, so I'll definitely recommend to you that if you kind of struggle with understanding this stuff. And by the way, you can kind of pick and choose from the 100 references. Like, you don't have to do them like number 1 and then number 2 and then number 3. Like, you can pick and choose, but if you don't want to think about it, just go by just numbers. I make the eyebrows. Almost always I have to make the eyebrows and irises darker, because, you know, from the first step, you know, just by doing shadows and core shadows, that's usually not enough. So I just start by darkening that stuff, reflected light. You know, the lips almost always need to be darker as well. The corner of the lips right here in between, you know, the corners. Then the top lip, kind of like this. And then the space between the bottom lip. Then the cheekbone also needs to kind of get a little bit darker. Then this plane needs to get a little bit darker. Then right here, this plane needs to get darker. And then this one as well. So see before and after. So just darkening some of the planes. And by the way, when you're doing this and you understand glazing and brush strokes and all that stuff, the beautiful thing is that you can do a lot of things at the same time. Like, you can darken something but also refine it more, because you understand that plane and you understand the edge. So it's kind of like you're darkening it, but you're adding more detail as you're darkening it, you know. Hope that's not too overwhelming though. And then when you add that, let me see, what am I missing? Kind of like this transition needs to be a little bit softer. This needs to be a little bit softer. And I think that's it for the shadows. Maybe a little bit darker right here. Later, when you add the highlights, a lot of the things that you need to add more of kind of like show through. But definitely don't shoot for exactly what you're seeing in the reference. Like, don't try to impress me on the critique live streams for detail. Like, honestly, I'll be much more proud of you if I just see like good separation and good edges, rather than just seeing some unnecessary detail and some shit that, you know, you just try to make it look like the reference. Like, it's much better just to kind of like have a few good brush strokes than have a lot which don't mean nothing, you know. So that's just some subtle mid-tones that I did. See that? Like, it's just super subtle, but when you add those subtle transitions, it just it makes it even more three-dimensional. Then definitely maybe like a soft edge right here. And see how I'm not even adding some brush strokes that I'm not inventing planes. Like, I'm pretty much following all of the planes. Like, it's all about trusting the planes, so you can kind of keep it simple and not overwhelm yourself. Once you have that, you know, we start developing the lines, the lights. Pick a lighter color, new layer. Start out right here with the forehead, big glazing like this, then big brush, kind of like that. Smaller brush right here for the edge. I should have removed those lines a little bit more, because they're still too visible. Because if you have too many lines, like, they're actually gonna fuck with your shading, because they're gonna make it look like, you know, there's random fucking lines everywhere. But remember, you're not a fucking master, so you can deal with some random fucking lines everywhere. You have this plane right here, which is gonna be lighter, so I make that first, and then I just kind of glaze everything else. Then you have this plane right here for the nose, top of the nose, the transition. And see, like, because when you look at the nose, it's kind of obvious that it starts really light and it gets darker as it kind of goes down. So that's all I do, is I start out with a really hard edge, and then I just make a brush stroke going down, and using an eraser I just kind of fade it out, and I just glaze on the other direction. So I start out going down like this, but now I'm gonna go in this direction like this, because this plane like this, you can also go that direction, but because I want to glaze this whole area, I just kind of glaze really slowly going this way, and then a really small brush stroke like this, and then just kind of like lasso tool, hard edge. By the way, I hope that, you know, you're not like a total beginner, just kind of like watching the different videos without doing any fucking exercises, because if you haven't done any of the exercises before, I feel like this all of this information and all this stuff might be like, it might overwhelm you, and it might make you feel like you know you want to quit, because it's like, oh, how did you even make this choice? I'm never gonna be able to do that. And it's like, bro, you will. You just gotta follow all the steps beforehand. So don't feel like, you know, you need to watch all the fucking videos just to kind of like start doing the exercises. Like, you just watch video, you just start doing that one exercise. You don't need to watch all of the videos. I should have said that before, man. I swear, my painting course, bro, I'm gonna know what to say on a painting course. This just practice, baby. We're practicing right now. I'm using you as fucking test rats. How does that make you feel, huh? So this is the before and after with the highlights. See, really hard edges and just kind of like glazing over through the transitions. Really hard edge right here on the edge of the plane, and then like a soft edge like this. You know, don't forget, even though I don't draw this plane right here on the forehead, the one that I showed you on the corner, it kind of continues like this. Even though I don't draw it with lines because I feel like it's too messy if you do that, I still, when I'm shading, I'm kind of like thinking about it. Then one thing I forgot to talk about, the shadows. Right here on the corner of the eye, you can kind of see that there's more of a shadow. So I actually make this with like a smaller brush stroke. So see, before it was kind of like this, and I just made like a small brush stroke because there's gonna be more of a hard shadow like right here on the edge. So let me see if I'm missing something. The lips, you know, a highlight. Oh, don't forget the little highlights. I know you guys love this shit. Like this, and then a little brush stroke, and then the eyes need to be a little bit brighter like this. And by the way, again, this motherfucker doesn't even look like, you know, the one in the reference, but who cares? If it looks like a good structural painting, it means that you're fucking learning. As you get better, you know, with rendering and stuff, you can get more and more into likeness. But for now, just really focus on the painting skill. Like, it's purely a skill. It's not about you just copying the reference. Okay. Then you have maybe a little bit of glazing right here because this needs to be lighter, and a little bit of glazing on the downside because it needs to be darker. So before, after, maybe a little bit of definition right here. Refinition? What the fuck is definition? That's refining and definition, baby. We combining words now. Fuck you, Dean. Fuck you, Dean. Fuck you, Dean. And then a little bit of glazing right here for the bottom of the nose because it needs to be darker. So I'm still not going full value, like especially with references where you can, you know, see all of the darks are actually pure black. Don't try to, you know, don't try to do that because you're gonna end up with a really flat portrait. So let me show you the before and after of the final. So we started out with this, and now we have this. Before and after, baby. Oh, I actually forgot to talk about the hair. But with curly hair, you know, that's gonna be something super fucking advanced. So definitely don't try to do that in you know, in this stage. But I just get like a highlight, and if you squint your eyes, this is what I'm trying to paint. So look at the reference, squint your eyes, and this is kind of like the effect that I'm going for. So I just make big brush strokes, and I just think about the transitions and kind of like the different planes. It's not the subtle texture. Like I might make like a smaller brush stroke and then just kind of make brush strokes like this and use those little overlaps for some texture. But I'm not trying to get the curly effect or none of that, because that's really just you're gonna waste your time doing this, because it's not the stage, it's not the step or time to do this. So I might make like some glazing over, and you know, some small brush strokes, just kind of like tapping it over. Just really squint your eyes like really hard, and just kind of like try to paint what you see with squinted eyes. I mean, that's for this reference. For another reference, for example, this one, squinting eyes is not going to help you as much because then you have big forms. You could have the spaghetti hair, and with this one, you just have transitions and stuff. So it's not like a big overpaint. This was before and this is now. It's just kind of like adding the effect of hair. It's not about making it look exactly like hair. All right, let's get to the front view now. So let me merge everything. This one is kind of, I think this is the worst when it comes to the before, but I actually kind of like it in the after. You know, in the before. And by the way, that's another thing about the planes. This doesn't look at all like the reference. And this one, you know, still doesn't. But, you know, you can kind of like see that it's sort of a person. This looks like a weird robot person, and this starts looking more and more like a face. So if you just trust those planes and you make them tighter and more refined, you know, it's gonna start looking like a person. So start out introducing a little bit of contrast through those levels, and then just new layer. Oh, you know, we forgot to fade out the lines. So brush, fade out all of this shit. Leave the nose, eyes, eyebrows, but you know, the planes under the eyebrows, all that stuff. Maybe some of the lines in the ears, they might be a little bit too much as well. And just kind of clean it up. Okay. Now, new layer, and really start paying attention to the transitions. So first, I start out with darkening the eyebrows. That's gonna be the first thing. Darkening the irises. You know, usually I do like a brush stroke on top of the eyelashes. So that way, I talked about it last time, that there's always gonna be a shadow under the eyelashes, because the eye, you know, the eyelid is always casting a shadow. I mean, naturally, if the light is coming from top, which usually is, it's gonna cast a shadow from the eyelid onto the eye itself or onto the eyeball. So right here, you're gonna see a shadow being casted. So this is before and this is after. You know, it's just purely one line kind of like going across it, and it adds a lot of line weight on top of this. And I also usually do this for the upper eyelid. Like I add a small brush stroke like this just to kind of like define the plane. Remember what I said, when you want to like really define a plane, you just make your brush stroke smaller and you just almost do like a line, like almost like a normal line. And then I make my brush stroke bigger, and I just kind of like glaze over on top of this eyelid, because even though you don't see it as much on the reference, this upper eyelid is going to be much darker than the eyebrow planes. So it's kind of like, if you look at the reference, you have the eyebrow, like even on top of the eyebrow. So it start one, this is going to be light, dark, dark, and then super dark. So that's all I'm going for. Let me just bring back my eraser to 100%. So I just glaze over the upper eyelid just to make it darker, and then I go with the color from the local color, and I just glaze over this middle plane to make that lighter. So I make the upper eyelid light darker, and I make this one lighter. Now that's, of course, that's not going to be for all references, but you know, it just kind of shows how separating those planes and really thinking about which one is going to be light and which one is going to be dark is going to add so much more, you know, so much more definition. So look at that before and after. You know, it's not, again, it's not fucking details, it's not eyelashes, it's none of that stuff. It's purely just decisions on the planes and their transitions. Then you have, you know, maybe a darker one right here on this side, and then it kind of like fades out, and that's it for the eyes. Then we start going down towards the nose. You know, on the edge right here is gonna be a core shadow, so I just add like one brush stroke in the middle. I just kind of smooth it out with the smudge. I make the bottom darker, like the drop shadow, and now it kind of starts looking like there's almost like a reflected light on the bottom of the nose. But I actually didn't add any light. Like only the only thing I did is I made everything around it dark. So see that nose, before it looked like this, and now it looks like there's almost like light coming from the bottom, but it's still the local color from before. I just made everything else around it darker. So That's one kind of like thing you can use when it comes to reflected light. Like, remember, it's all about things being relative. So if something, like if you look at the reference and that nose on the bottom, it looks lighter and it looks darker on the bottom, you know, all these decisions that I talk about, you have to make a choice. Do I make the one below it and yours doesn't look as dark? Like if yours look like this, you have to make a choice. Do you have to make the upper light or do you have to make the lower dark, you know? And according to that choice, everything else around that nose is gonna change as well. Because imagine that, you know, you decide to just make this lighter. Well, if you make this lighter, then you're gonna get the same value as the one on the cheeks. And if you look at it here, it's definitely not the choice. Like if you look at this value, that's around like 40, and then the cheek is around 60. So that doesn't make sense to just add light to this. So instead, I just make everything around it darker. So that's the choice that I'm talking about. I'm just looking at the reference, and then I just look at mine, and I'm like, well, okay, I know it's about, you know, things. It's about things, how they compare to each other. So I just make a choice. Well, does this need to be darker or does this need to be lighter? So the lips, that one needs to be darker. Then right here on the side of the face, these things needs to be darker. Then the eyebrow area, kind of like this, glaze it over with one brush stroke. The other side needs to be darker as well. Cheekbone needs to be darker. This actually whole side of the face needs to be kind of darker. So what I do is I make my brush as big as those kind of like planes, and I just glaze over with one stroke. And by the way, the reason why this glazing kind of works, and the reason why I didn't use it as much in the previous stage, is because it only works if you already have some definition in the planes. Like if you have no definition, let me show you actually. Let's say you have nothing in here, like what most people don't have. Even if you don't, like I still have some of the lines. Imagine if you don't even have the lines. So if you just do one, like you do some glazing like this, it's gonna look good, but there's no planes there. So as much as you shade, as much as you try to make it darker like this, it's still gonna look flat. Like it's still not gonna have any definition. So what you have to do is first define some of those planes, and then when you kind of like glaze over on top, now you kind of get the softish, I mean a little bit, it's not too soft, the softish sort of look, but then you also kind of keep the structure. And then I think about this plane, kind of like which comes between, like you see how the fuckboy area, I mean it definitely fits him. So this is gonna be lighter, and it's gonna be darker, and then lighter again. So I just make this darker between this, and then immediately that shit starts looking lighter on the other side. So I didn't make the reflected light, like in this reference there's not as much reflected light. Like what I do is I just make everything else around it dark, and that kind of gives the idea of reflected light. So this is kind of like for the cheeks, what I did is a lot of glazing and then just defining the planes and also the nose. Then maybe some of that nose kind of like connecting to the cheek, sort of like this. And then we have maybe the neck needs to be a little bit darker. Definitely need to separate it from the head. So make a lasso tool. By the way, for the lasso tool, I should have done a tutorial on the lasso tool, but if you actually use shift, so when you pick a lasso tool, if you use shift, you add to the selection. So when you press shift, you make the selection bigger. If you press alt, you take away from the selection. Damn, I should have talked about this before, but it's a really important thing, because when I make the selection, it's not usually perfect. So let's say I want to click this, I just use shift and I just kind of add it in here. On tap, you have different type of lassos. I always use the basic one, and with the plus, I just kind of like add to the selection, just to kind of like make the perfect selection. I mean, it doesn't even need to have to be perfect, but just like sort of. And I just glaze through the whole neck, just kind of like make it darker. So again, the first stage is definition, kind of like separation. Actually, it's not definition, sorry. The first stage is separation, and then this one is definition and kind of like refining the planes. And then the next stage is going to be really rendering, which once we have all the right values in the right place, and we have sort of the right edges, we really go in and we just make like all the what you call details and all that stuff. But you're gonna see it's still not details, it's still just kind of like small refinements. It's just kind of like even smaller than before. So by the way, I'm not zooming in. I didn't talk about this as well, but you never see me while doing this exercise. I never, like, if I zoom in, it might be like to just check something out or see if I'm right or something, but you never stay zoomed in like this, because when you're zoomed in, you can't even judge like the bigger picture. And again, because it's all relative, if you just stay into one place, you can't even judge what's happening. Like, you know, because what I said before, if you just make the eye perfect, it might look like good like this, but when you zoom out, the whole picture might look worse. So just always focus on the bigger sort of picture. Then the triangle is a little bit too obvious, so I just kind of like glaze over, and this is what I have for the side of the face. See that? Just refine it even further. And now let's get to the, what did I do? Oh, these are the weird examples that I showed you. I just had these layers. I'm like, bro, what the fuck was I doing on these layers? Okay, so now we make an actually let's do the hair while we're still on this. This is the first example where I don't forget the hair. So make the brush stroke kind of darker and just refine the hair. Smaller brush strokes. You know, I think about the planes, but now I think about more just introducing more values. And actually with this hair, I'm gonna show you a little trick with the rim light, but that's gonna be towards the highlights. For now, for the shadows, just think about how the deeper shadows, kind of like the core shadows in the hair, are gonna be sitting, and how they're gonna separate kind of like the hairs. So keep making your brush bigger, smaller. Look at that shit. Before and after. Finally, let's make the iris a little bit darker too. Okay, now let's get to the highlights. So new layer, pick the local color, pick a lighter around 60%, you know, because if the local color is like 40-50, the light needs to be around 60. So when I'm pressing, you can kind of see how it's not 80, because 80, you know, you're not gonna build it up, but it's also not 50 because 50 is too subtle. So around like 20 points on top of what you already have for the local color. I start out with a big brush stroke, just kind of like glazing on top of the forehead. If I don't see any like big definition, I'll just kind of like stick to the glazing, and then I'll kind of like separate the planes a little bit. So if the definition is huge, like for example, what's a good example? So right here, what I told you in the beginning, this plane with the cyan, it's definitely gonna be separated in this from the yellow, but I both know that they need to be lighter. So what I do is I first separate the one with the cyan, I make it a lighter color, and then I glaze through with the yellow, because it's more obvious of a transition. If it's not as obvious, like for example with this angle right here for the forehead, you can kind of see how it's a soft transition everywhere. I first start out with the glazing, so I glaze through the whole thing, and then I just kind of like refine the middle one, because you can see how in the middle it's a little bit brighter. So I just glaze through and I refine it in the middle a little bit. But if you start out with refining it in the middle, kind of like this, and then you glaze through, you can kind of see how it's a much more of an obvious transition. So if it's not that obvious, just more glazing with a big brush and then refining a little bit. And then, you know, don't forget the top of the eyebrows need to be a separate plane, kind of like this, even though, you know, I didn't add that in the planes. Then for the nose, kind of like going down like this, you know, maybe smudge too for the sides, because it's a soft transition. And then this plane right here needs to be sort of a harder transition. You can kind of see how in the reference right here with the blue, it's a hard transition. So also a really hard edge right here for the eye, and it kind of goes around like this. Same on the other side, and then use the eraser to kind of like scope it out more. So when I make this, like the thing that I just did, it's kind of like I made a lot of different choices at the same time. So let me break this down for you. So when I make a brush stroke over here, what I'm thinking about is this plane, like, you know, you have this one right here, and then you have this plane, and you have the nose. So when I make this middle plane right here, I'm thinking about the edge that it needs to make with this plane. I'm thinking about the edge that it needs to make with this plane, and with the edge that it needs to make with the bottom. Now, because of the bottom, it's going to be pretty much the same edge. It's not as important, so I just kind of like leave it for later. But this right here on the top, this thing with the green, that wasn't really green. This thing with a green, it needs to be a really hard edge. This thing with, let's say the pink, it needs to be a semi-hard edge. So it's still hard, it's just not as hard. So I told you to kind of like keep it simple and decide whether it's a soft or a hard. But when you have something like this, you know, it's obvious that this edge is gonna be much harder, because it's gonna be, that's gonna be a much more of a transition from the eye to the cheek than it's gonna be from the cheek to the cheek, because this is pretty much the same thing. Like, that's just the cheek rotating. This is a whole other plane. Like, this is the eyeball making a connection with the cheek. So that edge right here needs to be a lot harder than this one right here. I mean, not a lot, but it still needs to be more obvious. And this thing with the orange, it needs to be a super soft transition. So when I make that brush stroke and you just see me like, woo, one brush stroke, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna make the same one, but that's what's happening in my head. I'm just thinking about all these different planes around it and kind of like how it connects, and like, does it need to be as hard as this one, or does it need to be softer than that one? So hopefully that just makes more sense. And I feel like these breakdowns, I need to do a whole video where I just break down different things, but I feel like they're much more useful than you actually seeing me paint it, because when you see me paint it, it's like, well, okay, but you know, what is the process behind, like, what is the thought process? And the thought process is me like experimenting a lot and studying a lot, but this is what I think about, is all those planes and all these transitions. So I make it kind of smaller for the sort of the plane in the tear duct. You know, I make a soft glaze kind of like on this side of the eye, on the other one as well. Then I kind of keep going down for the second circle. You know, there's like a second circle that's going around the mouth. I just make that plane more defined, and then I just go for the mouth area again, kind of like this, and see how my brush is actually rotating with let's erase some of that line. It's rotating with the plane. So I'm not just painting the whole cheek at one time. Even though they're super close in value, I'm still thinking about it as separate things. So if you actually look at this one, oh, actually this is useful. So if you look at this whole area right here, right, this is gonna be pretty much the same value. But I don't treat it like the same plane, because when you treat it like the same plane, your brush like actually looks like you didn't really separate them. And even if you paint them with the same value, if you paint them at different with different brush strokes, your eye is gonna notice that, okay, this is different plane. Let me show you. So this right here, I make a selection like this, and I go around like this. Then I kind of soften it, and I make a new brush stroke going around for the other plane. So see how even though it's similar in value, it's really subtle. Like, it's really subtle, but you can see how one is going around like this and the other is going around like this. So this is what I mean by different brush strokes in different planes. And then for the top, it's gonna be totally different. It's gonna be kind of going down and then going on the side and then glaze over the triangle, because the triangle is too obvious now. So see that even though that they ended up looking the same value, this is how you get done. Like, this is how you put a lot of sort of quote unquote detail with very few brush strokes, because I'm making a lot of different decisions at the same time, and I'm not just like, it's about you just really understanding what you're doing. So when I'm painting that plane, I'm not just making it brighter, but I'm really thinking about that plane and how it connects to the other planes. Then you have this one on the side, kind of like, you know, the right here on the edges of the mouth, and it kind of goes down like this. And then you have the highlight for the lip, and then you have a really hard edge. Like usually this edge right here is going to be really hard because the shadow from the lips is going to be a drop shadow. So remember, when you're drawing shadows, you need to know whether it's a core shadow or a drop shadow. And when it's a drop shadow, you really need to exaggerate it and make it even harder. So this shadow is going to be one of the hardest ones because it's going to be from the lips and then corner of the lips. I make a light right like this, and you can kind of see the before and after. You can kind of see how it really builds, like the face now looks rounded. Before it looked a little bit flat even though there's shadow on the side, and now when you add that light, now it really starts looking like a 3D object. A little bit brighter right here on the edge. Then don't forget the ears, of course. Be kind of brighter like this. Darker on the planes inside. And then you have the neck. So lasso tool, big brush stroke, and boom. Now when you add those highlights, you can kind of see, oh, let's don't forget the little highlight of the nose, and then highlight right here on top, like a smaller brush stroke. So for the highlight, it's not like, you know, I try to paint any texture or anything. I just make my brush smaller. So when you make it smaller, it just kind of produces like a more, and I press harder. So for the other plane, this is kind of like the brush stroke that I use. So if you look at the slider, it says 70%, right? So watch this. So I'm gonna do one line like this, and then I'm gonna do the same 70%. I'm gonna do a highlight on top. So see, without changing the slider, with 70%, I can get both the plane and the highlight. So this is what I mean by, you know, controlling and mastering your own brush stroke. It's not about you just constantly changing. I mean, you have to, when we get to color, you're gonna notice how much we change that. But with the shading, it's purely like a mastery over your brush and knowing how hard to press. And, you know, of course, making it bigger and smaller, because that affects it. So when it's smaller, you produce a lot more of a hard edge, and you press a lot harder. I mean, if you don't press as hard, naturally you're gonna get the same, but usually when I make it smaller, it's because I want to define something more, so I press a lot harder. When I make it bigger, I just usually want to glaze, so I just kind of like glaze it like this. So that's it for the lights. And now you can kind of see how when we introduce the lights, you can see some of the shadows now look unfinished. Like for example, this shadow below the nose looks way too rough, like according to the as opposed to the reference. So we make a new layer and we kind of like go back to refine the shadows a little bit. So I'm gonna pick somewhere with the color picker where it's a lighter shadow, but I'm still not picking from the lights, because if you do that, it's gonna be way too light. So I just pick somewhere where it's like reflected light or something, and I just glaze over this shadow. So that's another sort of a trick with the glazing, is once you refine and once you show and define that this is a hard edge right here, you can even get the value from the mouth and just kind of glaze over this and make like a soft transition. So this is how you make a hard edge and a soft transition, is you first refine the hard edge and then you make the soft transition. So look at it before and after. Because a lot of people, when they see a gradient, they think that you're supposed to go with a soft edge first. And that's going to be a mistake for this drop shadow, because you need a hard edge there, but you also need a transition. So it's all about just defining the shape first, kind of like a plane, and then introducing the transition. That's what I mean, you know, in the past, with the past video, it's like you show the plane first and then you make the transition. So that right here, I pretty much do the same for the other ones, like the transition right here, maybe introduce like a hard edge like this for the triangles to be more defined. And then right here on the edge, let me actually not remove this. Right here on the edge, you can kind of see how the edge of the portrait actually has a little bit of a light, right? And that's because right here on the edge, you're gonna see the triangle, but the triangle in front of you is gonna be barely visible. So it's pretty much just gonna be one. Let me actually clean up this because I didn't, it's way too messy. But the triangle is pretty much gonna be like just with the lasso tool. Remember, the lasso tool is really useful for hard brush strokes. And then just the edge, kind of like refining it like this to make it look like that triangle is just sitting in the back. But I have too many lines, so I'll just kind of like erase some of the lines so you can see more of the paint. So you can see there's just adding that light in the back. Look at how much it shows the volume, because what you're showing to the person is that this is a rounded form. It starts out with light, and then as he gets to the edges, he gets light, a little bit dark for the nose, but just in general it gets darker, 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 and then the edge is like light, boom. So that makes it really look like a 3D object. And then you have a little bit of light right here for the edge as well. So see, I just gotta go up like this. So look at how much more of a difference those subtle transitions make. And then, you know, highlight right here for the iris, and then a little bit of light like this, boom. And then the eyebrows need to be kind of darker like this. Maybe a little bit darker into the lips on the bottom, a little bit darker below the lips. The shirt, maybe a little bit of glazing. And now let's do the highlight for the hair. So look at that again, before and after. Boom! I'm too proud of this shit. And now for the hair, we're gonna get like a really light color, like maybe 60. Actually, let's erase some of that lines, because if you want to do some rim light, you know, those lines are actually going to be too dark. So I erase some of the lines, and then what I do is I make some small brush strokes, and then I get an eraser and I just kind of erase, you know, pretty much like the H that I showed you before, but now I just do the H on only one side. So I introduce like a brush stroke, and then I just erase one side. So that makes it look like, you know, there's edges of hair. So it's kind of like the hair is, you know, it's kind of like going with like shark teeth, but instead of me actually going and drawing that, because that makes it look like awful grass, I just make one brush stroke, which is gonna be bigger than the grass hair, and then I introduce the the eraser, just to kind of clean it up. You can kind of see how it gets this really nice effect. So when I make a brush stroke, I don't erase the whole part, but I just erase one part and I leave the edge. So see how the edge is like really sharp, and then here there's like a soft area, and there's like a soft edge in here. So it's a really beautiful thing for hair, because with only one single brush stroke, you just show so much. Like you show the edge, you show the transition, you show like the whole shape. Like it's really useful. That's what I would use for this hair, and it's just like making it different. So it's not the same brush stroke over and over, but I kind of like make it smaller, make it bigger, and then afterwards I might add a couple of small brush strokes, like what you call grass hair, but just a little bit, just to kind of like show that it actually has that texture of the hair. So you can kind of see like that's literally 7-8 brush strokes, and it kind of like looks like hair. But then don't forget that you also need to do that inside a little bit as well, because if you only leave it on the edge, it kind of like makes it look weird. So you can kind of see in the reference how it's right on the edge, and as it gets more front to the hair, it gets less and less, but there's still some of that. So more brush strokes like this, you know, keep changing the angles, keep changing the size, then a little bit on the side, kind of like how it rotates around the head. And then inside of the hair, maybe a little bit more, one here. And then inside of the hair, you know, I introduce some of that H. You know, you can kind of see how it has this sort of spin around, so it kind of goes like this. So that's what I'm gonna try to do for the hair, because if you just leave it kind of like this, it's just gonna look boring. So try to look at the reference, see what looks interesting, and just try to imitate that. So what really looks good is if it starts like this, and then as it gets closer and closer to the side, it actually starts rotating. So it's kind of like rotating like this, and then I use the H. It's like rotating, boom, H. And it kind of like this, and then I make the H. So I try to not make it as bright as the edge. Actually, the edge I can make that because I keep that on a separate layer. I go to brightness and contrast, which is Control H for me, but if you're using the standard shortcuts, you might be Control B, I think. And I just make that brighter. And then right here on the edge, you might use a couple of different brush strokes like this. So that's it. We went from this to this with just some rim light and stuff. So this is it for the front profile, front angle. I don't even know what I'm talking about, man. I've been talking for the last 2 fucking hours. We have this into this, man. Anyway, this is it for today. These are all the examples. I really hope this shit was fucking useful, man. Let me hear any questions you might have. Send me work for critiques, you know, angelganef6@gmail.com. Hit me up with any questions, emails, all that stuff. I'm so happy I fucking recorded this shit. I'm gonna talk to you next time. Love you, baby. Peace.